This is Duke University.
For Wolf of the Thomas International Center, which is located in Raleigh. He was a big piece of bringing Hadley down for today's event, and so I'm going to allow him to introduce Hadley. But first, I'm going to encourage you to take one of our flyers for our Student Symposium happening March 1st and 2nd. That's a National Federalist Society deal, and you can get half scholarship for airfare to go out and spend a weekend in, from what I've heard, is beautiful Austin, Texas. Additionally, we'll be tabling tomorrow morning and early afternoon with Dunkin' Donuts, coffee and donuts, advertising that as well. So stop by tomorrow and say hi. With that, Christopher Wolf.
As Phil said, I'm co-director of the Thomas International Center, which is an educational institute that tries to promote people thinking about the big questions in life, where we come from, where we're going, and how we should live our life in between. We draw especially on classical and Christian intellectual resources from Plato and Aristotle to C.S. Lewis and John Paul II, and with a special preeminence to Aquinas' natural law teaching and the political philosophy of the American founding. And we do various activities at Duke, at UNC, NC State, other places in the area. So I hope we have a chance to see you on other occasions. I want to introduce my friend Hadley Arkus today. We're very fortunate to have him here. He's been a member of the Amherst faculty since 1966, and something of a legend there with a kind of trail of students from over the years who are view him as a mentor. He's written many books. Among them are the book First Things and Beyond the Constitution, Constitutional Illusions and Anchoring Truths, Natural Rights and the Right to Choose. He's also a prolific writer for periodicals of various sorts, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, and especially the journal First Things, which took its name from his book, getting back to the fundamental questions that are at the foundation of life and of society as well. Hadley is perhaps especially famous for having been the proposer and the advocate and the architect of the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. Hadley thinks that getting people to talk about foundational questions is really important. And so in his pro-life work, he wants to especially get people to talk about what the status of that thing in the womb is. And the Born Alive Infant Protection Act, he thought, was an important way to do that. And basically what it says is that if a child should, in a sense, accidentally survive an abortion, it says that the doctors and others have to take steps to preserve that life. Of course, that raises the question, why preserve that life? And if you're preserving it now, why not, 5 minutes ago? Yeah. So this is something that Hadley may say some words about today. He proposed that, I think, back in 1988, and then eventually it was, in fact, proposed in Congress and passed and signed into law in 2002. Hadley's also the founder of the Committee on the American Founding at Amherst College and has organized many events on the principles of the founding, and especially arguing that the founding is rooted in natural law principles. And Hadley is, one of the top 2 or 3 advocates, academic advocates, and so he's public advocates as well, of natural law in the American civil society today. And one thing you might, if you're interested about in that, you might go online and just Google Hadley Arkus and Alex Kosinski. who had a very interesting exchange on natural law at the National Federalist Society meeting last year. More recently, Hadley has also established the Center for the Jurisprudence of the Natural Law and is doing different activities around the country in conjunction with that. So today he's going to speak on Roe versus Wade, 40 years later, natural law and the jurisprudence of abortion.
Thank you. Good. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks to Phil for inviting me. I'm going to come over here because I'm awfully distant from the audience back over there. This is the first time this is my second trip to the law school here. I was here last, I think, in the 90s when I was trying to get support for that bill to protect the child born alive. But that gives me the slenderest excuse for telling a very old story about second times. I can't resist telling it. I probably should. It's a story about one of those guys who teaches those courses on marriage and the family, these sexy courses, and he was supposed to give a talk at the Kiwanis for lunch, and he couldn't do it. He was trying to prevail upon a friend of his, professor of English, to give the talk for him on modern sexual practice. He said, I said, I don't know anything about this. How could I give this? Any literate person can do it. I'll leave you my notes. So he's about ready to go off, and his wife catches him. Where are you going? He said, I'm off to talk to the Kiwanis. What on earth about? Well, rather than getting into the whole story, he says, parachute jumping. Parachute, I just took it up. Then about a week later, the wife ran into the head of the Kiwanis at the supermarket, and he said, your husband gave the best damn talk we've heard all year. Really? That's strange. He's only done it twice in his life. And the first time he got sick to his stomach, and the second time his hat fell off. So it just struck me, it's my second time at the law school, and I did bring a hat for today. As Chris mentions, I've been on the road really trying to in this project of restoring the natural law as a more coherent version of conservative jurisprudence. But so they want to do something about Roe versus Wade, so I will just sort of weave it into this because not do the real talk on natural law, but for the sake of showing that the argument over abortion has always been an argument from natural law, not an argument drawn from religious premises or matters of faith, as I'll try to explain. My path into it may be coming this way. On the night that Barack Obama was elected back in 2008, he addressed a large audience in Grant Park, in my hometown, Chicago. And the next day, Jim Stoner at LSU emailed me. He said, did you notice he said 221? We built this country calloused hand by calloused hand, but 221 years? Now, Mr. Obama celebrates Lincoln, but the secret, nicely concealed, is that he really rejects the moral grounds of Lincoln's teaching and the doctrine of natural right that supplied the ground of Lincoln's premises and his mission. Because Mr. Obama counted back to the beginning of the country 221 years from 2008, and it turned out to be 1787 with the Constitution. In radical contrast, Lincoln said famously at Gettysburg, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth. And he took the beginning of the country not with the Constitution, but with the articulation of that proposition, he called it, that first principle, that father of all principles among us, all men are created equal. And from that proposition, everything else radiated. As Lincoln drew on Proverbs saying, a word fitly spoken is like an apple of gold in a frame of silver. The frame is made for the apple, not the apple for the frame. The Constitution was made for the Union, not the Union for the Constitution. The Constitution is a structure of power designed to produce a weave of practice consistent with that first principle. The first Constitution proved dysfunctional. It had to be rejected in favor of something else. Now, I just noticed that Mr. Obama yesterday took what looked to be a different line. He began with the Declaration, and all men are created equal. But the point is, as he made clear in his book, he never accepted the notion that all men are created equal was, as Lincoln and the founders thought, a real truth, a truth that would hold its place in all times and places. Lincoln said, "All honor to Jefferson, who articulated an abstract truth applicable to all men in all times." Mr. Obama said yesterday, well, history teaches us that history may teach us next generation that it really wasn't true. That wasn't the understanding of Lincoln and the founders. The understanding of natural rights, can't do the whole thing, but the essential point is that there are certain rights grounded in the very nature of human beings, which will be the same in all places where that nature remains the same. And the understanding, some of you may recall, ran simply in this way: that certain rights grounded in nature, in the things that separate human beings most distinctively from the things that are either subhuman or superhuman. And as the understanding ran, no man is by nature the ruler of other men in the way that God is by nature the ruler of men, and men are by nature the rulers of horses and cows. And even in this age of animal liberation, we don't sign labor contracts with our horses or cows, or seek the informed consent of our household pets before we authorize surgery on them. But we continue to think that those beings who can give and understand reasons deserve to be ruled with a rendering of reasons in a regime that elicits their consent, and contra Mr. Obama, we don't think that will change 100 years from now. History won't yield up different lessons. And Jefferson said, anyone who denies that point, that argument, has to assume that the mass of mankind were born with saddles on their backs and that the privileged few were born with spurs on, ready to ride them. And by this ground, of course, it was wrong to rule human beings without their consent, which is why slavery was in principle wrong everywhere, not simply in the United States. Okay. Now that was the core of the doctrine of natural rights of the American founders. Rights that will be the same in all places where that nature remained the same. Mr. Obama, in his book, made it clear that he didn't regard it as a truth. It was something people happened to care about and they share, but it's not really a truth. Now, I've been part of that movement over the last 30 to 40 years to try to restore that doctrine of natural rights. And Mr. Obama really reflects those doctrines that become the new orthodoxy in the American campus. Because in the new doctrines, quite fashionable on the campus of postmodernism and radical feminism, seen by people like Judith Butler, natural right, there are no natural rights because there are no moral truths that hold in all places. What you people call nature is really socially constructed from one place to another according to the vagaries of the local culture. And there are no moral truths that, of course, hold in all cultures built on an enduring nature of human beings. But the curious part about these people is that they still cast moral judgments across cultures. They condemn genocide in Darfur, apartheid in the old South Africa. They think they can identify wrongs done to women in other places. In fact, they think they can identify women in other places. So in the curious world of the left on the campuses, there are human rights to be vindicated all over the globe, but strictly speaking, there are no humans. There's no human nature. And since there are no moral truths, there are no rights that are truly rightful. Okay? Thomas Aquinas said that the divine law we know through revelation, but the natural law we know through that reasoning that is accessible to human beings as human beings, and that way natural. There has been no more compelling example of natural law reasoning, the kind of thing that people, when they hear it, they get it right away. No more compelling example than that fragment that Lincoln wrote for himself when he was imagining himself to be engaged in a conversation with an owner of slaves, putting the question, why are you justified in making a slave of the black man? Is it because he is less intelligent than you? Beware, the next white man who comes along, more intelligent than you, may rightly enslave you. Is it because he's darker than you? Beware again. The next white man who comes along with a complexion even lighter than yours may enslave you. And Lincoln's argument is simply a model of principled reasoning, accessible to, you didn't need a college education to understand this. It was accessible to people across the religious divides. The upshot was there's nothing you could cite to disqualify black people as rights-bearing beings that would not apply to many people, many white people. And we've simply, in the pro-life movement, simply drawn on the same model of principled reasoning. We say, Why do you regard that offspring in the womb as somehow less than human? Doesn't speak yet? Well, neither do deaf mutes. Doesn't have arms or legs? Well, other people lose arms or legs in the course of their lives without losing anything necessary to their standing as human beings to receive the protections of the law. Once again, the upshot is there's nothing you could cite to disqualify the child in the womb that would not apply to many people walking about well outside the womb. And notice, again, as with Lincoln, at no time, in no place in the chain of reasoning is there an appeal to revelation or to faith. You don't need to be Catholic to understand this argument. In fact, that has been the argument of the Church, that you don't need to be Catholic to understand this argument. It's an argument born of natural reasoning, a combination of moral reasoning along with the evidence of embryology. But if that's the case, that there is no principal ground on which to consider the offspring of the womb as anything less than human, then the argument shifts to another axis. Because the kinds of reasons we need to justify the taking of that small life would have to be at least as compelling as the kinds of reasons we demand in other cases for the taking of other human lives. And so no one may doubt the strain that another pregnancy could add to a mother already near the edge, or the strain that could be produced in the finances of the family to add a child. But the strain on the psyche of the mother and the finances of the family could arise with the addition of an aged parent to the household just as well. And in strict justice, when it comes to straining the psyche of the mother, there might be a better case for removing the 13-year-old who's already the terror of the household, rather than the offspring who hasn't had the chance to show any benevolence yet. Now again, no one would make light of these strains, but we simply have to point out they don't rise to the level of the justifications we demand in other instances for the taking of a human life. If we didn't understand that the child was human, there'd be no problem of an unwanted pregnancy. If the offspring were going to be a bird or an orange, there's no problem of getting rid of an unwanted bird or an orange. The unwanted pregnancy becomes a problem because people already know what it is. There's no doubt about the nature of the offspring. We know it could be a potential lawyer, a potential outfielder, but it's never been a potential human being. As soon as it's there, the pregnancy test is the sign. Something is live and growing. No question whether it's alive. If it is alive, it's not undergoing a change of species. And that's one of the most compelling things I read years ago before I switched on this position was Paul Ramsey showing that there's nothing you and I have genetically that we didn't have, SAT scores, allergies that we didn't have, and we're no larger than this period at the end of this sentence, the zygotal dot. It was all there. The child in the womb may not be wanted, but we don't usually think people lose their claim to live or their standing as human beings when they suddenly become unwanted. By that measure, Mr. Romney would be in serious danger now, and Joe Biden will always be in serious danger. The child in the womb is dependent on the woman who's bearing it, but we don't usually think that people lose their standing as humans when they suddenly become dependent on the care of others and become ill or infirm. There's a danger here of backing into another version of might makes right, that the right must be strong because they prevail. On the other hand, the very fact that you're weak and dependent means that you are barren of rights and have no standing. Well, that's been the core of this matter enduringly, the question of that human person, whether we evade that question simply by a facile shift in labels. That's not a human person, that's a nigger, that's not a person, it's a fetus. It's simply shift the labels and we remove a whole class of persons from the class of rights-bearing beings. That was the dramatic, radical nature of the shift that the Supreme Court brought about 40 years ago with Roe versus Wade. The court cited a string of cases on privacy, but as I've sought to show in other writings, none of those cases, including the right to marry, claimed a right that was insulated from the restrictions of the law. There's a right to marry. That right to marry can be restricted at many plausible points, but considerations of age, consanguinity, used to be a man and a woman, no more than two. In fact, Justice White, one of the two dissenters in Roe, once startled Justice Stevens. So Stevens is easy to startle. he startled Justice Stevens by saying, I too could accept Roe versus Wade if it were put on the same plane as all those other cases from which you derived it. The right to privacy, the right to marriage has never meant that the law could not offer serious restrictions on those rights at many plausible points. But what we created here was something that could not finally be restricted. In Roe, the court set forth an understanding of a pregnancy divided into trimesters, with the sense that later in the pregnancy, that right to an abortion could be subject to some serious restrictions. But in the companion case of Doe versus Bolton, they said those restrictions could always be trumped by concern for the health of the mother, and health could include mental health, which is to say, if any one woman claims that she'd suffered distress in not having it, she could have it. Okay? So you can have the abortion up to the entire length of the pregnancy for virtually any reason. And yet most people in the country had no sense of how unrestricted this was. My dear friend Mary Ellen Glendon at the law school at Harvard once surveyed 25 of her colleagues at the faculty of Harvard and found only 5 of them could give an accurate account of what the holding was in Roe and Doe versus Bolton. One savvy observer of the polls observed years ago that about 60% of the public readily reject, even people who call themselves pro-choicers, readily reject 90% of the abortions that are performed under Roe versus Wade. And yet most of the public has been against any move to overturn Roe versus Wade. Well, how do you account for that? My own surmise was that most people don't know what's in it. In fact, when we were writing questions for the Republican senators to ask of Sonia Sotomayor and Kagan, to ask them, would you simply explain what's in it? What the holding was? Because there have never been more than 22 to 24% of the public that has been behind the policy of abortion on demand for any reason throughout the entire length of the pregnancy, which is, say, the law installed in Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton. And it was for the sake of breaking through that cloud that I came up years ago with that proposal I wrote for the debating kit of the first George Bush. I used to say I wrote some of the best things that Ronald Reagan never said. And I wrote something that the first George Bush didn't say either. But we're trying to move simply to preserve the life of the child who survived an abortion. Because in one notable case, Floyd versus Anders in South Carolina in 1977, we had a case of a child who'd survived an abortion, undergone a surgery, died after 20 days. And when the question was raised, was there an obligation to preserve the life of the child? The answer tendered by Judge Hainsworth, Clement Hainsworth, whom Nixon tried to appoint, the answer tendered by Judge Hainsworth was no. There's no right for treatment there. That's not a child protected by law. It is a fetus marked for termination, which is to say, the right to an abortion is the right to an effective abortion or a dead child. So what I was suggesting Mr. Bush do is say, why don't we just begin there, to begin a conversation? Because our friends on the other side said abortion is not infanticide, which means they're willing to protect the child at some point. So let's just invite them to tell us when they're willing to start protecting the child. And if we can't agree on anything else, how about birth? Can we simply agree to protect the child at birth? The interests of the mother are no longer entangled, encumbered by the child. The child can be put in the hands of people ready to sustain it. Okay. Well, when the bill on partial birth abortion was struck down in June 2000, this was the only thing on the playbook, so the National Right to Life finally got behind me, and I led the testimony on that bill when we introduced it in July 2000. It was finally passed in July in 2002 with the Democrats in control of the Senate, and the one who introduced it in the Senate to get a unanimous vote was this Deputy Majority Leader at the time, Mr. Harry Reid. Now, in that awful legislative language, that bill was called the Born Alive Infants Protection Act. We'd remove any criminal or civil penalties. It was a bill simply designed to plant premises in the law and deliver news that would come as jolting to most people who didn't know that the right to an abortion not only extended through the period of birth, but even after the child came out. Most people didn't know that. Okay. We didn't try to conceal our understanding. We told them, look, if you can give us that main premise, we think we can unravel your whole position. Because as Chris said, you'll have to tell us what was different about that same child 5 minutes earlier, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months earlier. But at the same time, we say, it's a conversation, we'll persuade you. If we don't persuade you for the next step, then we don't persuade you. But from that whole vast volume of 1.3 million abortions, we might be able to save a handful of lives, and that we regarded as no trifling thing. Now, to the astonishment of some of my people in the pro-life movement, the day we came out with that bill, National Organization of Women came out in opposition to the move to protect the child born alive. The pro-lifers couldn't believe they would do something like that. But it revealed an interesting part of the story, which was that the people on the other side understood this bill better than some of my own allies, because they saw the principle that lay at the heart of the thing, that once you concede that we can protect that child, yes, that matter could be unraveled. Congressman Jerry Nadler in New York, where we had a cluster of women around him telling him, don't make the Democrats vote against this. You're just going to be embarrassing us. Just play rope-a-dope. Go along with it. It's a very modest bill. Don't draw attention. And that's the playbook they went with as they finally voted for it, except the playbook didn't get to one notable figure, a state senator in Illinois, Barack Obama, who led the opposition to that bill, and through his chairmanship in the committee in Illinois, managed to kill it. He became the only national Democrat, now the only president, who has ever rejected the notion of protecting even the life of the child who survives the abortion. That matter didn't make much of an impression on the campaign. It was screened out by the media just as they screened out any information about the bill itself. But it did make for an interesting argument that we tried to make during the confirmation hearings over Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, because the Democrats have argued that Roe versus Wade should be a settled law now, as Roe Inspector said, a super-duper precedent. And the question we would put to them was this. 2/3 of the Democrats in the Congress voted against the bill to bar the partial birth abortion with 70% of the child dangling outside the birth canal. The man who appointed you did not think that the right to abortion ended even when the baby came out. So the question is, do you think, are we past that? Do you think the position of President Obama now is indefensible? Or do you think it's a live question? It's arguable that, and if that's the case, that we haven't settled that question of whether the right to abortion now extends even when the child comes out, then the implication is the meaning of Roe versus Wade is hardly settled as a precedent. We're not at all clear on what it means. Okay? Now, if the Republicans had come in, I would have made the case for going back and having hearings to add the penalties on the bill, because there wasn't a single Democratic vote in opposition. People voted, Jerry Nadler and others, to protect the child born alive. Now it's reasonable to come back and say, you voted against to protect that child. You thought it was wrong to withhold medical treatment from the child. Now, how serious was that wrong? What kind of a penalty do you think one should have for killing a child born alive? Is it at least as serious as a traffic violation? We might as well put the question. Jill Stanek, a nurse in Chicago who testified for us, blew the whistle on the so-called live birth abortion being practiced in Christ Hospital in Oak Lawn, Illinois, where the child is simply delivered whole and put in the refuse room uncovered to die. And as Jill got on the air in Chicago to talk about this, nurses were calling in from all over the country saying, we've been doing that for years. Even we did not realize how extensive this practice was. It would be worth going back and holding hearings. But Jill thinks that this may actually be the favored abortion for people in the middle class. It's the safest. No instruments are introduced into the womb of the body of the mother, and there are no body parts of the child left behind to cause infection as the child is dismembered. The Born Alive Act carried no penalties. The only enforcement was the possibility of removing federal funds, which is very tough to do. Even that's been hard to do, but people haven't realized yet that that very modest measure, the most modest first step at all, is probably the most powerful lever that is available right now. And it's enhanced by a case that's become, some of you know, an icon for liberals. The case of the Bob Jones University in 1983. Some of you may recall that the university lost its tax exemption because it barred students from dating and marriage across racial lines. It's a private entity. The allegation was that the policies of the university were not in accord with public policy. But they couldn't be sued under the Civil Rights Acts or prosecuted because no one was denied admission to any program or the university on the basis of race. It was simply a private policy barring marriage and dating across racial lines. By the way, at the time, the New York Review of Books would have ads, personal ads, reading SWM seeks SWF, single white male seeking single white female. You know damn well the New York Review would never put in an ad saying white tenant, landlord seeking white tenant. What that told us was that even people on the advanced left did not think they're ready to make a law to bar discriminations in the private choices of partners in sex or marriage. There was nothing in the public policy on that point. But now we do have a statute. There is a statute that bars people from withholding medical treatment and care for a child who survives the abortion. There is a statute now. Now there's a perfect ground in which people complain to the IRS about any facility, hospital, or clinic getting a tax exemption that houses these live birth abortions, withholding treatment from a child who survives the abortion, and just about any one of all of these facilities are dependent on tax exemptions. The story of the Born Alive Act, how I came up with it, how I argued, how we moved it through the Congress, it's an interesting story I don't have time to tell today. It's told in this book I did in 2002 for Cambridge, Natural Rights and the Right, this handsome book that's just used by my family all over Chicago as a coaster to put under drinks. That's told there. But I used three vignettes from that book to make my argument. And I'll use those three vignettes to take me to the end of this talk. The first involved one of my favorite students who came into my office, was talking to me one day, and he leaned in to say, you know, I've never been quite as enamored of natural rights as you have been. And I said, really, why is that? And as the conversation went on, he sort of focused on that character in the gutter, that homeless person who might have broken his own life. I said, yeah, we seem to look upon him as bearing a certain dignity or sanctity, even though he spoke. I said, why is that? And my student then gave me what we might call a kind of postmodernist song and dance. It's because of the lens by which we in this culture have come to look at him. Whoa, wait, time out. You've changed the subject. We're talking about him. You're telling us about our lens, how we come to view him. You've stopped talking about him. What I want to know, is there something about him that has this certain sanctity you mentioned, which becomes the source in terms of rights of a certain sanctity that the rest of us should be obliged to respect? The second vignette, I had a commission to do a piece on the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I went through with my friend Alan Greenberg, the architect. And as we took a turn, we came across a scene that some of you might have witnessed here, might have seen. This vat filled with shoes, as the Nazis trying to save things they could salvage or sell. And curiously, what came flashing back at that moment were those searing lines of Justice McLean in his dissenting opinion in Dred Scott, when he leaned in and said, you may think that black man is chattel, but he is a creature made in the impress of his maker. He is amenable to the laws of God and man, and he is destined to an endless existence. That is, he has a soul that will not decompose when his material existence comes to an end. I think you get the full sense of things when you realize that the Nazis looked at the scene and they thought the shoes were the durables. Now, I have colleagues back at Amherst, people of large liberal sympathies, and they often omit that line from Nietzsche amplified by Dostoevsky. God is dead, all things are permitted. There are people of vast sympathies for injuries of people in the world, but even they have to concede that they could not give the same account of the wrong of the Holocaust and the wrong of slavery that someone like MacLean was in a position to give when he'd say in words quite familiar to many of us, those creatures may be diminished, but they are made in the image of something higher, we think. The third vignette comes from Brookline, near a couple of hours away from me in Amherst, the scene of a shooting at an abortion clinic about a dozen years ago. And about 2 nights later, there was a candlelight vigil. And one woman was there with her newborn infant in her arms, and she said, I'm here to preserve for my daughter the same reproductive rights I've enjoyed, which is to say the right to kill that child right up through the time of birth. And you say, really? That child is the bearer of these rights by virtue of being a woman? Is it a species of natural right? Natural rights that can't be taken away from her? James Wilson, one of our founders, said, if we have natural rights, when do they begin? And the answer was, as soon as we begin to be, which is why the law, common law, casts its protection on human life from the first stirrings in the womb. Was it a species of natural right? If that's the case, then that child had those reproductive rights as soon as she began to be as a female. If that's the case, her mother couldn't have been authorized to have swept away the rights of that child through the simple expedient of sweeping it away in a stroke, the bearer of those rights. So it can't be that way. It must be that reproductive rights are trumping, which means that the child acquired those rights as the mother, in a grand Nietzschean gesture, said, I now confer these rights on you because there's nothing in your existence I regard as detrimental to my interests. Well, if that's how it happens, then it doesn't begin with anything in the child herself. It has an intrinsic dignity that becomes the source of rights of intrinsic dignity that the rest of us are obliged to respect. And it brings us to this problem, that if this is sort of how we acquire our rights, then even if there were this thing called the right to abortion, let me concede that, even if there were right to abortion, it now would be stripped of its moral logic, because it's stripped entirely of its connection to natural right, because now it's rather like the right to use the squash courts at Amherst College. It's something that is conferred. It's conferred by people who have the power to confer it as it suits their interests, and it lasts only as long as those people are willing to see it preserved. They are free to withdraw it at any point as it suits their interests. So part of the argument here, if that's a story about how we get our rights, it's not only that the right to abortion is now stripped of its logic, all of our rights are stripped of their moral logic, and the people who take this line are no longer allies for us in the defense of any of our rights, because they can no longer give a moral defense of those rights, or of that regime that began with the notion of unalienable rights that attached to human beings that we're obliged to respect. But here I am back at Duke, and the best place to end is with that question I was posing when I was here. I was here to make that pitch for that thing I was trying to find backers for in Congress. And one of my former students who was here at the law school, Darren Malamy, thought he'd recruit for the talk at the medical school and bring out a number of people who would be on the other side or even hostile to the pro-life side. It was just fascinating to see the eyes, because you could see the hostility in the room. But as I laid out the case for the Born Alive Act, you could see the hostility kind of melt. And people seemed to become absorbed in the problem. And I was very touched by one young woman who worked for Planned Parenthood on the Hill, who came up and said, "Do you know, this sounds sensible to me. I think you ought to get a vote on it." Well, the purpose of that measure was to start a conversation. And with everything I've said in covering the sweep of the argument, it may still be the best place, even in this group, to cut into the problem. So I ask earnestly, if you're with me and nothing else, could we not begin the conversation at this point and say, could you not be with me on that move to protect that child born alive? We put the question, we said, trying to get a preamble going, we said to people on the other side, like Jerry Nadler, would you not concede then, could we not say that that child marked for an abortion has a claim to the protection of the law that doesn't pivot on whether anyone wants her? Or do you say you're protecting her because it pleases you to protect her and you'd cease to protect her when it ceased to please you? If that's what you mean, tell us, amend this thing. But if it's the case that she has a claim to the protection of the law that cannot pivot on the question of whether anyone wants her, it probably follows also that she has a kind of intrinsic dignity that does not depend on her location or whether she serves the interests of anyone else. I think these simple questions contain all of the truths and claims that this question of abortion may ever claim, may ever contain. And it's the simple question, I guess, I would pose to you now anew on my return to this charmed place. And to raise this question anew is to raise again the question of Lincoln and the founders and the way we used to reason about these things in a principled way about natural rights, and is to remind us of the things as a people that we once used to know. Thanks very much. I'm open to questions. Yeah. And thank you. I meant to thank you all for taking the time with classes resuming to come out for this talk. Thanks for being here. Okay. People have to dash for the classes now. Yeah. Any for questions? Yes.
I guess I just have a question about natural law and how, you seem to say that it's so self-evident, basically, and that it can be discovered, just through this sort of reasoning. But natural law in itself has come to mean so many different things over, centuries and even millennia. I mean, the classical version of natural law held that there was a natural hierarchy of humans, and so, it was the divine will that certain people be subordinated or subjugated. And so, I guess I just wonder, especially considering I can imagine there's a lot of people in this room, or people in general, who would say that it does violence to natural law for the state to, essentially strap a woman to a table and force her to give birth, because that violates her bodily autonomy and, right to self-ownership. So in light of that, how do you reconcile those conflicting conceptions of natural law?
Well, first of all, to recognize that there is no doctrine, school you can cite, no position. Let's say the argument on abortion. Perhaps Mr. Obama's position embarrasses you, that maybe people won't agree on that. The fact that people may disagree in the pro-choice community doesn't mean that there is no sort of plausible position that they have. And the question for you is, if there are serious disagreements about the matter of natural law, do you think we can talk about those things and resolve them by trying to gauge whether some of them are more or less plausible, more or less persuasive, more or less true? Which is to say, are the canons of reason in place for the sake of doing all this? One of the things that are working here is that you'd have to give an account of what is your account of the ground of your own regime, of the natural rights founding of this regime, why you have those rights, why you think that a regime based on the consent of the government with free elections is in principle better for despotism. Is that simply your preference? Or do you think that it's good because most of us prefer it, or it ceases to be good if most of us cease to prefer it? Or do you think there's something right in principle about it? So you'd have to go back to that question. But look, we have in the antecedents, and part of what I do, making the pitch, is to remind people the way the American founders understood these things. So Alexander Hamilton would say, for example, the passage you probably remember, the Federalist 78, that we work under this construction. that any later statute supersedes an earlier one. But that's not the rule of construction we use when it comes to the Constitution, because the Constitution coming earlier must be able to override the statute coming later, or else it loses its function as a control on the legislative power. And Hamilton says, how do we know this? It's not part of the Constitution. It's not part of it. It's the reason and nature of the thing. The founders are constantly bringing us back to axioms, those axioms that had to be in place before we had guidance in forming a Constitution. So the argument that Hamilton employed there, I hope you'll recognize, is the same argument used by John Marshall, Marbury versus Madison, to say that if a statute comes in conflict with the Constitution, if we allow the statute to override the Constitution, we're simply converting the Constitution into an ordinary statute, right? And Marshall will later say in McCulloch versus Maryland, gee, the Constitution gives Congress the power only to punish piracies on the high seas. Only piracies. But if the Congress can establish the mails, that the power to establish must entail the power to preserve. Presumably, Congress can protect the mails against theft. And how do we know this? He draws the answer from the very logic of a law, that if a law cannot be enforced, it is not binding. And if it's not binding, how could it be a law? When you created a national government, it meant you created a national entity with the power to legislate, to make laws. My point is that first generation showed its remarkable knack of tracing their judgments back to those axioms that had to be put in place in order to have a constitution. And you find out, what does it mean? It means that thing. And those are the things to which we appeal when people doing natural law make some of the arguments we think are really specious. You always have these arguments, but the question is, do you not sort of assume that when you see these arguments, you yourself have some means of telling the difference between a plausible and an implausible argument? And when you do that, you are back to what Hamilton and Marshall understood the natural law to be. So my pitch, was when people say, my friend Dermot O'Scallon, Judge O'Scallon on the West Coast, said, we can protect the natural law only when there's something in the Constitution that gives us we have some evidence that we think that the founders meant to protect certain natural rights. He's offering us a rule of construction. The Constitution can protect those natural rights when there's some evidence that the founders thought the right to bear arms was something they wanted to protect. But notice, that rule itself is nowhere in the Constitution. How do we know it? So to ask the question, does the Constitution encompass those axioms of reason that form the ground of the law? It's like asking the question, do I have to use syntax when I order coffee? It's always there. It's always there. You ask a long question, I gave you a long answer, and then complete answer. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Well, since I've solved that one. All right. Anything else? Yeah. Back here.
In talking about natural law, I've often heard this kind of conception that it's based on reasoning from principles, but it seems to often also make reference to a divine source, at least to get the ball rolling on the sanctity of human life and things. But I know there are people like Larry Arnhart who say you can ground natural law in some sort of Darwinian perspective because human nature is enduring, if not permanent. Do you think there has to be a divine appeal to get?
No, I just gave the example and pointed out that, Aquinas' line, if God wished me to be ruled by faith in everything, he wouldn't have given me the gift of reason. The notion of natural law, that we can reason about these things without appealing at every point to faith, has been part of the Jewish and Christian tradition. Remember,
Not at every point, but at any point, can you reason about it without making any divine appeals whatsoever?
Well, look, James Wilson used to read Jean-Jacques Bellamacqui, and Bellamacqui said that there's maybe two sources of the law. One, you may have confidence in it because you think it was made by a divine lawgiver. Second, you have confidence in it because you think it's in accord with reason. He said, but we call that the internal incentive. The external incentive was made by a divine lawgiver. He said, but we have more confidence that it was made by a divine lawgiver when the reasoning is compelling, right? So if Moses came down from Mount Sinai and said, God said, don't worry overly much about that adultery stuff anymore, or theft, people might be scratching their heads about that. At a certain point, some of us will argue in the vein of Lincoln, no, this could be done with principled reasoning. But some of our friends, especially on the evangelical side, will press us, and I think we have a point to say, all right, but you finally come to know, what is it that gives you your confidence that this person in the gutter who's broken his own life, where do you find sanctity in him? And it could be, they have a point that some of us see it in a different way when we do think that he's made in the image of something higher. And the critical question for us, so taking up your point, the hard question for us is if that assumption and that is not woven into what we're doing, somebody else is going to have to explain who is doing the heavy lifting on this point that used to be done by that God who was the creator of those rights, right? That we keep invoking. You're right. They've got a serious point there. And I remember a colleague in biology say, Hallie, I know you think there's a moral agent. It's just a bunch of aqueous protein on the move, right? If that's all you see it is, you're going to have very hard to explain why you treat even those diminished people as people you need to respect. So, I mean, it's in many cases, people made the point, it's not original with me, that our religious understanding really forms the deep capital that we bring to this matter. And we may forget from what the source of that capital was, or why we look out in the world in this way. Yeah, I think, and there you have, I think, a tenable point. But again, remember, when I was visiting at Princeton years ago, I think there was somebody from Nigeria there. He said, it's curious that the Muslims want Sharia law, but the Christians think they can live with a secular state. The Christians think they can live with a state that does not invoke faith or revelation, and with laws that should be understandable to everybody across the religious division. Of course, they're bearing a long tradition, both in Christianity and Judaism, of natural law reasoning. Nothing odd here. Right? Look, I remember in the opening of Federalist 31 on taxation, the thing was about taxation. And in the course of that paper, Hamilton didn't reach any conclusion different from what, say, Bob Dole in our own day would have reached. But any disinterested observer looking at the text would see at once some strikingly different furnishings of mind. And I can leave you with this one, because this is how Hamilton put it. And it's reflected of the mind of the founders. Hamilton said, in disquisitions of all kinds, there are certain primary truths, or first principles, upon which all subsequent reasonings must depend. These contain an internal evidence which, antecedent to all reflection or combination, command the assent of the mind. Of this nature are the maxims of geometry, that two lines cannot enclose a space, that two things equal to a third are equal to one another, and of like nature are those maxims of ethics and politics, that you cannot have an effect without a cause, that the means must be proportioned to the end, and there ought to be no limitation placed on a power destined to effect a purpose which is itself incapable of limitation. Just the way Bob Dole would have said it, I thought. If he put his mind to it. But no, reminded of the point that, John Marshall at the end of Gibbons versus Ogden saying, apologizing to his readers, that classic case of the Commerce Clause, which I hope people at Duke are reading. At the end of that, he said, he apologizes for his readers for spending so much time demonstrating what should stand the class of an axiom. He assumes that all of his readers know that before you can do a demonstration, certain axioms have to be in place which cannot be demonstrated. If I don't know the law of contradiction and know a controlled experiment, here's A, here's B, here's A, here's non-A, I can't do a demonstration. But if I don't know the law of contradiction, it can't be explained to me in the form of a demonstration. I often say, look, I'm saying, this is what these people knew. That's how they did jurisprudence. And part of the loss in our own time is that we forget how they did it. They had this remarkable knack of tracing their judgments back to those anchoring premises and axioms that were in place before they even set about writing this Constitution. Right? And that, I think, is part of the thing we have to recover, as part of this enduring work of the American regime. Yeah.
Does the natural law analysis or reasoning change if the mother's life is in danger?
Well, yeah, because I did a book called First Things, which it is not a categorical proposition to say that it's never justified to take a human life. People can, take human life in self-defense. You can't put on the same plane the killing done by Hitler and the killing of those who would be killed unjustly by Hitler. But even the laws with Roe versus Wade would say, okay, when the mother's life was in danger, that's a tenable reason, right? That's a tenable reason. So sure, and you can argue about other points about how much danger she faces and during injuries, but at least we understand that what you have to do is cite some injury comparable to the seriousness of what you're doing in the taking of a human life. Right? Anything else? Yeah. I've said one more, and I'll do Kant's answer to Hume, and we'll finish it off. Okay. Yeah.
I'm quite sympathetic with your account of natural law, even if I think it should be strongly qualified on many levels. But what I was
sure, I'm open. Start doing it.
But I wanted to ask you. I come from Italy, and in Italy, abortion is legalized, even if with a much stricter rule than here in the United States. But then the real debate about abortion in Italy is about the policies to sustain and make more possible motherhood. And instead here in the States, I always hear a lot of fights about abortion. I don't hear a lot of considerations about policies that can make motherhood more easy. So I think of, for example, in Italy we have 6 months of full paid maternity leave. We have things like universal health care for the mother and the child. I understand that there is a strong case to be made for the moral wrongness of abortion. But I just wanted to ask from you, since you are involved even in policies, how can we sustain motherhood? Because oftentimes abortion seems the only choice for the mother. For economical reasons, not only for not every mother is so morally perverted that she wants to kill her own child. Sometimes this seems the only choice.
Okay, an apt question, but I hope you keep the whole structure of things in place here, because as my friend Bill McGurn at the Wall Street Journal would say, once you're at Planned Parenthood, you have the abortion, that ends the relation. But you're at a birth counseling clinic, they try to get an apartment for you, try to provide clothes for the baby, try to nurture the mother. The people who are the pro-lifers, usually the people who are concerned about cutting off welfare support, trying to provide aid for the baby, not wanting her out the door as soon as the surgery takes place. But we have to be careful not to confuse the level. To think of, I remember this calls Nazi Germany, if you don't like this way of treating the Jews, let's find some other way of giving property to deserving Aryan owners. I say, I don't have to purchase from you my right to go to defend innocent people who are going to be killed. And I don't purchase my right by giving you a redistribution policy to help out Aryans. And we have to, if we're in the first place, we're dealing with an unjustified killing of a human being, then you don't make that case easier by saying, but if you could buy it away from her by saying, we'll give you welfare payments. The presence or absence of the welfare payments does not efface the fact that you're still dealing with what we might call an unjustified taking of a human life. That has to be faced in its own terms. See? Now, I see recently feminists have been making that argument about, let's fill out that other side of the argument, and that is all quite tenable. But they're also faced, a former student of mine at Smith College had her baby, left school and had her baby, and came back to Smith and posted pictures of the baby, and she's getting nasty comments from the other side, like, you let down the side. You let down the side. Somebody in your position, the rational, defensible position for the modern woman is to destroy. Look, I think you touch something, you use a phrase that I think people may not cite onto, that sort of doing something so perverse as killing your child. But it's true, I think, that even people on the pro-choice side would be startled by the claim that I'm claiming something novel here, the right to engage in a private killing of a human being for nothing other than my private interests. They'd be startled by that. They recoil from that claim. But then the problem is, in the recoil, they sometimes fall back on something even worse, that the right to decide just who is a human being is something I should have the right to decide according to my own private interests. This is a problem I think they can't get round. Well, I've left you with something grim. As Woody Allen used to say, I'm sorry I can't leave you with something positive. Would you accept 2 negatives? Okay? With that, I think, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Arkin.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.